Welcome to this session on requirement elicitation. In this session, we are going to talk about some of the challenges which business analysts face while doing the requirement elicitation. We'll also discuss about some of the techniques which can be used to analyze the requirements. Let's start by looking at what is the track record of software projects over the years. There are many studies which get conducted every year. One of the prominent groups which conducts study on the software project success rate is Standish Group. This pie chart is a report which was published in 2009 by Standish Group. If you look at the pie chart, it shows that 32% of the projects succeeded of all the projects which were surveyed. Remaining 68% of the projects were either failed or were challenged. Challenged projects are those projects which were either late or they were over budget. If you look at this table, it shows you how from 1994 to 2011, the success or the failure rate of the projects have been. You can observe that the number of projects which actually succeeded over the years is less than the number of projects which have failed. This clearly shows that we are still not able to crack the success formula for software projects. So what are the reasons for the projects to not succeed for more than 50%? Same Standish Group also published the top reasons for projects to fail or succeed or getting challenged. If you look at these top 3 reasons, you will realize that some of the common reasons are relating to requirements or the involvement of the users. This has been a major challenge for the software projects across the board. Some of you who are already into software development and even project management, they should be easily able to identify what happens when you are actually dealing with customers. We are going to see some of the challenges which are associated with understanding or getting the requirements right. Let's start with a simple example. What happens if you visit a doctor with some problems? Let's say, for example, you have fever. When you go to a doctor, you state your problems to the doctor saying that, "Doctor, I might have fever." Now, doctor, instead of believing you what you're saying, he or she does his own investigation. So instead of believing what you're saying, the doctors typically investigate on their own and then they try to figure out what is the problem. That is called diagnosis. Imagine if doctors don't do their own investigation and simply rely on what you're saying. The implication could be severe. It could lead to wrong prescription of medications and you might be in trouble. One of the important points coming out of this example is perceived problem versus real problem. As a patient, you might be having your own perceptions about what problems you are having. But as a doctor has to do his own investigation and analysis to arrive at the correct diagnosis. This is something which is very typical in case of customer interactions. Now let's look at another example. Look at this series of figures. If I ask you to watch it from left to right, what do you see? Look at from the first figure to the last figure. When you look at the first figure, you can see the face of a man, and as you move to the right, you can see a woman kneeling down with her face turned to the left. In this case, if you are looking at the left hand side, you are looking at a different figure, while if you are looking on the right hand side, it is giving you a different figure. This is a matter of perspective, and perspectives can completely give different pictures of what is a reality. Let me now point out to another problem. As we know, in the Asian subcontinent, females don't shake hands mostly. That's the predominant culture which we are having. While in the Western countries, everybody shakes hands. Now in this case, what has happened is both of them, the Asian woman and the Englishman, they are trying to behave in the manner in which the other person is comfortable with. And because of that, the image which has come out has become pretty funny. This is again a problem while you are dealing with customers which are not of your own country or not of your own culture. So we have to keep that in mind while we are discussing the requirements with the customer. Now let's take another example which will talk about implicit versus explicit requirements. So what do we mean by implicit requirements? Let's say there is a customer which is looking to develop a book publishing website. When we say book publishing website, it's all about an author who is writing a book or writing any kind of a publication should be able to upload his or her on the website, which will go through revisions and finally will get approved before getting published. This is all about online publication. When the user comes and visits the website, the user should be able to search for the books which have been published on the website. This is the requirements which have been given by the user. Do you find anything missing here? It's a pretty simple requirement which have been further curtailed down just to make the examples shorter and simpler to understand. Now, from the face value of it, we can say that there is absolutely nothing missing here. But on further exploration, we will realize that in this particular case, one important aspect is missing. And that was when the articles are in draft state, whether the user should be able to search it or they should not. Now, this is something which the customers might tell you that this was so obvious, why didn't you realize it? You might say, why didn't you specify it? So the certain obvious requirements which the users or the customers don't feel like telling you typically become a bone of contention. And this is which is referred to as implicit requirements. Requirements which are hidden, not stated by the customers, but they are an important part of the requirements. In the last few slides, we have looked at a few examples showcasing what are the challenges which business analysts face while getting the requirements from the customers. So what are these challenges? Challenge number one is solving the right problem or finding the right problem versus just finding a problem. It's important to understand that unless you find the right problem, whatever solution you're going to suggest or you're going to do may not work. The second important aspect is perceptions versus reality. Customers have their own perceptions. They have their own preconceived notions. And when they are telling you the requirements, you need to explore it in order to understand the real problem. We'll look at some of the problem analysis techniques later in this presentation. And finally, implicit versus explicit requirements. We should use right techniques to arrive at the requirements which are not stated but are very much part of the overall scope of the solution. So these are the key challenges which any business analyst will face while getting the requirements from a customer. So how do we go about addressing these problems? I have tried and simplified and put 3 approaches which should be able to help you in getting to the right requirements. First of them is using the right problem analysis technique to arrive at the right problem. Now, the moment you start discussing the requirements with the customer, every piece of requirement which we can name as a feature, a user story or a use case, it might be having all the problems which we have discussed previously. There could be implicit requirements, there could be problems associated with perception. So we must use certain problem analysis techniques to arrive at the right problem. Selection of the appropriate requirement elicitation technique. So problem analysis technique is part of the requirement elicitation technique. Requirement elicitation is the process of interacting with the customer to get the complete set of requirements. We are going to discuss a couple of requirement elicitation techniques in the later part of this presentation. And finally, validating and documenting the requirements. Validation of the requirements is extremely important. How do we do the validation? There are various techniques which can be used to validate the requirements, and that will be covered in next presentation. Documentation is primarily to get an agreement from the customer on the requirements which have been documented and understood. Let's look at some of the problem analysis techniques. There are many problem analysis techniques which are available, and it is not associated only with software projects. Problem analysis techniques are generic techniques, and they have been used by various industry professionals across the board. So whether it's a financial problem, it's a software problem, it's a manufacturing problem, various techniques are used like decomposition, abstraction, that we'll be discussing while we are discussing the requirement analysis techniques. So some of them are 5 whys technique, decision trees, Kano analysis model. Kano analysis model, decision trees are some of the techniques which we use in detail in our business analysis course. Now, in this particular presentation, we are going to look at 5 whys technique. With the help of a simple example, we'll try to understand how can it help in arriving at the right problem. So let's take a case study to see how 5 whys technique is used to arrive at the right problem. So in this particular case study, we will be looking at a manufacturing company which is facing a problem. The customers of this manufacturing company are not happy because lately they have been receiving products which are not as per the stated specifications. So the customers of this company have agreed with their sales team about the particular specifications for the product, but when they were shipped, they were different. Now, if you hear about this particular problem, the immediate inference is that the specifications must be wrong. The salespeople might have committed a mistake by not documenting properly, or not even able to understand the correct specifications, which would be a fair point to start with. But let's see, if we use the 5 whys technique, how can we arrive at the final problem or the right problem? Now, 5 why technique is all about asking questions starting with why. So whenever you hear a problem, you ask questions. Why something is like this? And it is believed that if you ask 5 questions starting with why, you will arrive at the right problem. Of course, there are limitations of this particular methodology and it cannot be used in all these situations. But given the constraints, in this particular case, this works pretty fine and we'll see how it can be used. So now let's ask the first why question. Why are customers shipped wrong products? So in this particular case, the answer which was given by the customer was like this, which is very obvious, and this is the inference which we have drawn. Now you ask the further question, why? Why the factory of this particular manufacturing company built a product which had a different specification? Now the next answer which came up is because the salesperson who was trying to expedite the production of the product, he directly called up the factory head to explain the specification of the product. That means the specifications for a product were given on a telephonic call. There was no written communication. Because of that, there was an understanding problem. So naturally, the question which will come to your mind is, why did the salesperson give the oral instructions to the factory head? Now the answer is that sales director was the person who was the boss of sales manager, was supposed to always give a formal go-ahead for every product to get on floor. But because the sales director was out of the station, he could not give a formal go-ahead. And if the factory unit or the sales manager waited for sales director's approval, the product delivery might have got delayed. So the sales manager was right on his part to expedite and kind of preempt the production and the delivery. Right? Now, you can possibly stop at this point and say that, okay, fine. So, because this was an exceptional case. But the question might come in as to why does a sales director need to approve an agreed and signed contract? It's already been signed. It's already been agreed upon for a particular payment structure, for a particular specification. Then why does a sales director also need to approve it? So that is the next question. Why was sales director always required to approve? The answer was the sales director was supposed to report to the CEO on a daily basis about the orders received and the product manufacturing which went on floor. Because the CEO further had to report to the board, or CEO being a hands-on CEO wanted to be in the thick of the things. So the real problem was the CEO wanted the reporting on the order status and the fulfillment status against a particular order. So the real problem which we have now encountered is different from the immediate inference or the early inference which we had drawn earlier. This we can term as the right requirement. So how do we solve it is left to your decision and the customer's decision. But once you arrive at the right problem, solving it becomes easier. And that is what every business analyst needs to strive for. So what we have seen is how a simple problem analysis technique can be used at every stage of requirement elicitation to remove the perceptions, to remove the hidden requirements and get to the right requirements. Now let's look at the overall context of requirement engineering before we start looking at requirement elicitation as a particular step. Requirement engineering is a very broad term and it starts from the start of the project and ends with the end of the project. Sometimes you might feel that requirement engineering is only associated with requirements. That is not a correct assessment. Let's look at what is requirement engineering. There are two parts to it. One is called requirement development. Other one is called requirement management. Requirement development has 4 steps: requirement elicitation, analysis, specification, and validation. Requirement management also has 4 parts: traceability, version management, change management, and impact analysis. So what is requirement development? Requirement development is the initial phase of any project, and it involves understanding the requirements, analyzing the requirements, validating the requirements, and getting a formal approval from the customer. That means requirement development ends with signing of the requirements document in case of traditional SDLC methods. In case of Agile and other methodologies which are more iterative, requirement development is something which will keep on getting repeated on a regular basis or with each iteration. So what is requirement management? Requirement management starts when requirement development ends. So requirement management is all about managing the requirements. So when you have arrived at a set of requirements, what may happen later is that the customer might come back to you and say that this particular requirement needs some changes, or this requirement's now no longer required, it has to be deleted, or there could be few more requirements which can come in at a later stage. So managing the changes in the requirement set, maintaining the proper versions of the requirements is all about requirement management. So here you need to look at requirement traceability, version management, impact analysis. These are various aspects related to requirement management. So as we have discussed, requirement development has 4 steps: elicitation, analysis, specification, validation. In this presentation, we are going to look at requirement elicitation briefly. These are the techniques which can be used for requirement elicitation. Some of them you might be familiar, some of them you might not be. In this particular session, we are going to look at a couple of them, but I just would like to mention one of them which is very important, and typically it is used for commercial off-the-shelf products. Commercial off-the-shelf products are products like SAP, Oracle apps, products which are enterprise level products, or products which are implemented for a particular customer requirements. You are not going to develop it from scratch. So when you are eliciting the requirements for a particular product to be implemented at a customer location, the approach is slightly different in terms of how do you go about capturing the requirements. And that we will discuss in some other sessions. Now let's look at 2 of the important requirement elicitation techniques. One is which is known as joint application development. As the name suggests, it's a joint effort. In this particular methodology or technique, all the stakeholders, including the development team, the customer representatives, they sit together to go through various stages of the software project. So JAD is not limited to requirement elicitation itself. It can go beyond that. So during the requirement elicitation process, what will happen? All the customer representatives as well as business analysts will sit together and discuss each of the feature set or each of the requirements. So the clarifications, the analysis, everything will happen in the joint sessions. What are the advantages of JAD? The most important part, since all the stakeholders are together, the development life cycle becomes shorter. You can complete the same task in a shorter span of time. The second important aspect, since all the people are together, you get to know all the perspectives for the requirements from a customer side also. And reaching to the right problem or the right requirements becomes easier. However, please note that JAD may not be possible in all the scenarios, because depending on the number of the level of stakeholders involved in the project, it might not be feasible for the company to get together all of them. It may not be feasible for the company to arrange the meeting with all the people for a longer span of time. Rapid application development is also a term which you might have heard of, and rapid application development is nothing but a special case of JAD. The next requirement elicitation technique is prototype. This is again often heard term, and you must be familiar with prototyping in some form or the other. Prototyping is a proven technique and which have been used for years to build a model before the actual development or actual manufacturing. The same concept is applied for software development also. Before the actual software is developed, you create a model of it to better understand it. That is the principle of building models. So what is a model for a software? The screens, the UI or the user interface. Prototypes can be built in 2 ways. One is called throwaway prototypes, other one is called evolving prototypes. In a throwaway prototype, you can create simple wireframes or paper sketches to have a better understanding with the customer on the requirements front. Whereas the evolving prototypes are those prototypes which are built using some technology platform. It could be plain HTML, it could be built in .NET, it can be built in Java, which can be used later while developing the system. No matter what technique you use, the idea is to arrive at the correct set of requirements involving the customer, which is the second most important aspect of the technique. Because what happens whenever we see a visual form of anything, we are able to relate to it in a much better manner. Anything which is just on paper may not give us the right perspective or the right understanding of the system. So sometimes we can't even blame the customers, but you must have encountered this situation many a times where once the system is developed, the customer comes back to you saying that, but this is not what I wanted. I think you have misunderstood. So rather than getting to this point at the end of the project, it will be much better if we do it as early as possible in the project lifecycle. So prototypes are an effective way of requirement elicitation. However, it depends on one important aspect, and that is whether you have the right resources and the right amount of budget available to do prototyping. To overcome the budget problem, There are many tools which are very effective tools to create quick prototypes, and that can anyway be used for building the prototypes. Another approach which people take is to build the prototypes only for complex problems. So in this session, we looked at what are the challenges in getting to the right problems or right requirements. What are the different problem analysis techniques which can be used to arrive at the right problem, and what are the requirement elicitation techniques, and we looked at prototyping and joint application development as requirement elicitation techniques. Thanks for being part of this session.